Well, thank you everybody for coming out this evening. I was going to say it's wonderful to see so many people here, but of course the circumstances around this talk are very somber. I do appreciate though so many people coming out, especially on such a cold night. I was in the Donbass in Makiivka one winter, a long time ago, and it was about as cold as this. And I remember it as, it was a very bitter winter, so I really appreciate you coming out in such a cold temperature. I am going to do a brief technical check to see if I can actually work this clicker. Ah, yes, okay, apparently I can. Okay, very good. Thank you very much for coming out. It's a great honor to have you all here. I'm presenting today on the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the eve of the anniversary of that event. And I'm sure we all wish that it would be a peaceful anniversary. Unfortunately, it is not. This is a strange, tragic anniversary. The numbers are staggering. Since February 24th of last year, according to some estimates, the Ukrainian and Russian armies have each lost 100,000 people, dead or injured. It's according to some estimates. According to the United Nations, 8,000 civilians are confirmed killed, with over 13,000 injured. But the real numbers, unconfirmed, of course, are far higher. And we won't know for a long time. We want to have a good idea of how many civilians have been killed. According to the United Nations, 18 million people are in dire need of humanitarian assistance. 14 million have been forced from their homes, and nearly 8 million people have fled Ukraine completely since the war began. This is an enormous tragedy. In the circumstances, I am particularly conscious that I am not an expert on Ukraine specifically. I am a historian of the Soviet Union, including Ukraine, but not focused on it. I've been studying Soviet history for over 40 years now, and I've been to the Soviet Union and the former Soviet Union many times. My very first visit was in 1986, right after the Chernobyl disaster. My visits to the Soviet Union and Russia and the former Soviet Union include visits to Ukraine, but I haven't been there for a long time. So again, I'm not an expert on Ukraine specifically, but I'll try my best to talk about what has happened. My actual research is on various subjects, as Matt has described, including the Soviet science of air and water quality. Interestingly, a lot of the best scientific research on air and water was carried out in Ukraine, but that's for another talk, perhaps. This talk is instead based not on my own academic research, but on systematic reading of the last 2 years of the scholarly literature, press articles, websites, blogs, and other sources to do with the war in Ukraine and the background to it. My talk will not be about the war itself, but we can talk about that in the question and answer period afterwards. Because I am a historian, I will say a lot about the background, the deep context to this disaster. I will analyze recent politics too, although I'm not a political scientist, and if there are any political scientists in the audience, I encourage you to correct me in the question and answers period. I know there are people in the audience who have more experience and knowledge of Ukraine than I do, and I look forward to an informed discussion after the talk. I've given several public talks since the beginning of 2022 on Ukraine, even before the invasion. Some of you have heard them. I think the prize goes to George Kuhl for attending the most of them. I don't know if he's here this evening. Clearly, he's a very patient man. He's come to nearly every one. My talk today resembles the others, but I have updated it significantly. So if you have been to some of my past talks, especially the Sakva talk, some of this will sound very familiar, but I have made some changes. So I cover a few related things. First, how could this war have happened? We are still asking that question. Most of us in this field, and that includes me, were surprised when Russia invaded last year. It seemed to defy our understanding of Putin as rational and calculating, this sort of cold, calculating man in the Kremlin. 1 year on, we have a clearer idea of why this disaster has happened, but we are still asking the question. So my presentation today revisits that question, why did this happen? I have said a little in past talks about the approach to governance of the Putin regime. I'll repeat some of that here. I'll also repeat what I have said about Russian attitudes to Ukraine and Ukrainians and how these things overlap with that governance. When I was approached to give this talk nearly a year ago now, I chose the concept of identity because it is at the core, I think, of what has happened. My rough and ready understanding of identity is historically informed. Of course, I'm a historian. I'm speaking of the identity of groups of people, collective identity, but what characteristics do they share as members of that group? For example, language or religious belief. How do they become conscious of belonging to that group? Specifically, belonging to a nationality. What is that process over time? How does that group distinguish itself from other groups? Because I'm interested in how the attitudes of some Russians helped cause the war, this is a talk at least as much about Russian identity as it is about Ukrainian identity. Okay, what you're seeing here are a couple of slides that I showed in earlier talks on the war as I tried to figure out why on earth Putin had decided to invade. This is Kremlinology at its finest, or its worst. A lot of speculation based on little evidence. In this case, why the physical distance between Putin and everyone he was meeting had vastly increased from 2020 onwards. There was a lot of speculation on this last year, and before last year, even before the invasion, about why this was happening. Some of those speculations were really wild. I'm not going to go into that. The good news, if we can call it that, is that this isolation of the Russian leader and the physical distancing, the extreme physical distance, seems to be ending. He's now sitting closer to people. He's meeting people more often, and I think that's a good thing. In retrospect, it seems that the isolation, the physical isolation of the Russian leader really was due to fear of COVID. But the effect of that 2 years of isolation is troubling. Putin, before the pandemic, was consulting with a very small circle of people. This is something that developed over time. During the pandemic, he may not have been consulting very much, even within this small circle. And I will give one example which I haven't mentioned before. So on February 23rd, 2022, exactly 1 year ago today, and one day before the invasion, Putin was filmed meeting his Security Council. This is something that Putin likes to do. He likes to be filmed, he likes to be televised, meeting his ministers. He's always done this since he became president. So, for example, here he is in 2015 meeting Sergei Shoigu, right, his defense minister, looking very stern. Every evening, practically, on Russian television after he became leader, there was film of Putin meeting his ministers, very often berating them, right? So this was to demonstrate his leadership. Anyway, on February 23rd, 2022, Putin was filmed meeting his Security Council. So this is the very close circle of hardliners who worked very closely with him, and some have worked with him since the 1970s, actually, since long before he went into politics. So working with him in the KGB. The highlight was Putin dressing down Patrushev, head of the council, in public, dressing him down to more clearly support the independence of Luhansk and Donetsk. Patrushev was aware of the implications of such a move, of recognizing the independence of the People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, and he hesitated. But Putin was having none of that. And Putin was performing, he was demonstrating. I think the interaction between Putin and Patrushev was a proxy for Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. Putin, in this film, 1 day before the invasion, looks like a person who is fully confident of the decision he has made. He is distancing himself from his hardline supporters because he wants to take full responsibility for what will happen the next day. He does this because he believes he will actually be taking full credit for a victory he believes will be easy. He really does look like the cat who has swallowed the canary. So here he is berating his own hardliners who fully support him anyway. So he wants to make it very clear that this is his decision alone. We now know that the self-confidence was hubris. Was it also partially the result of 2 years of isolation due to the pandemic, not being restrained by other advisors? Possibly. But my talk today is designed to show that there are other deeper reasons for what has happened. Putin's supreme self-confidence on the eve of the invasion does come through very clearly, though. So, instead of Kremlinology, when I was approached to give this talk nearly a year ago now, I chose the concept of identity. Ukraine and Ukrainians have a complicated identity, both currently and historically. The very name Ukraine may have been derived from the word for borderland. The usage of Ukraine as meaning borderland is actually the subject of a fierce debate amongst linguists, depending on two different spellings of the word. The older view is that the name Ukraine is derived from borderland, but a more recent view is that with a slightly different spelling, it actually means country. So this is a debate that goes on. Anyway, whatever the origin of the word, in reality, in the past and present, Ukraine has been a frontier. As Serhiy Yekelchik has framed it, geographically and reaching back into ancient history, it is the frontier between the open and potentially dangerous Eurasian steppe and the protective forest further to the west. Culturally, it has been for centuries the borderland between Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Islam. And today it is another frontier. Today it is a frontier between Russia and the European Union. Being perpetually on the border challenges the conventional story of the modern nation. Arguably, we're seeing right now the delayed emergence of that nation. At the core of Ukrainian identity is the idea of Ukrainian as a distinct language. This is a particular sticking point because both Ukrainian and Russian originate in a common East Slavic language, or actually a shared collection of early medieval dialects. The conventional and older view of when the Ukrainian language started to emerge is in the 13th and 14th centuries, after the Mongol occupation of 1240 dispersed the East Slavs. According to this view, the Russian and Belarusian languages started to emerge at the same time. A more recent view in the scholarship is that Ukrainian started to emerge earlier, in the late 11th or 12th centuries, so before the Mongols arrived. Whichever view is correct, we can see that a distinct precursor of the modern Ukrainian language has been around a very long time. This is a talk at least as much about Russian identity as it is about Ukrainian identity. As I said earlier, one of the reasons for the war that I wanted to examine is the problematic attitude of some Russians towards Ukraine and Ukrainians. There is a long history to that troubling attitude. Some of this is lodged in the common origin story of both countries. Both share an inheritance from Kiev Rus, the largest political entity in medieval Europe, and Dave Hay may correct me there, but in terms of territory, the largest political entity in medieval Europe, with one of the largest cities in Europe, Kiev. Kiev Rus politically was really a loose confederation. It's hard to really call it a state. It had inherently disintegrative tendencies. Nevertheless, it was also a vibrant and original culture and society. What you're seeing here is a modern reconstruction of the medieval Great Gates of Kiev. Very impressive. This is a very impressive structure, a very impressive object. Please try to ignore the Pepsi stand in the foreground and just pretend that you're back in Kiev in 1100, right? So the Great Gates of Kiev, okay? I actually love the Pepsi stand. I have many pictures of the Great Gates without the Pepsi stand, but I always like to put that in there just to bring people back to reality. The gates of Kiev are very famous. They have themselves inspired arts and culture. Modest Mussorgsky wrote one of his movements from the orchestral suite, Pictures from an Exhibition, about the Great Gates of Kiev. And that is actually how I first came to a knowledge of things Russian and East Slavic. When I was very young, I loved the music from Russian and other Slavic composers. I didn't realize when I was listening to Mussorgsky's Great Gates of Kiev that I was listening to a Russian nationalist project. I was 7 years old. I didn't know. I just loved the music. Anyway, we don't actually know what the Great Gates of Kiev looked like. This is an impressive reconstruction, but it's also an informed guess. And an important thing to note here is that this was actually put up in 1982, okay? So this particular structure wasn't built in the Middle Ages. This was put up in 1982, and it was put up to mark the 1100th anniversary of the founding of the first East Slavic state, a semi-legendary event. Note the date, 1982, the last years of the Soviet Union. The last years of the Soviet Union. What is going on here? Why would the Soviet Union, the 1980s, it's starting to fall apart, put such an enormous effort into putting this up? It is symptomatic of a search for new sources of political legitimacy. After the death of Stalin, socialist ideology lost its vigor, and the regime reached out for new ways to legitimize itself. One way was to reach back to the deep past of the first East Slavic state. This was a new means to legitimize the Soviet project, but it worked the same way for ethnic Russians and ethnic Ukrainians specifically. As long as Kiev remained part of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, it was easy for Russians to present Kiev Rus as their historical legacy. Ukraine's independence in 1991 presented a direct threat to this historical mythology. The ancient capital of the Russian state, as Russians saw it, was now in a different country. It's been pointed out that if we follow this logic in quotation marks, to its conclusion, that Kiev is the origin point of Russian civilization, then really it is an argument for Ukraine taking over Russia rather than Russia taking over Ukraine. But I don't think that's going to happen. Instead, what happens when you lose the direct connection to your origin story? One solution is to try to invent another origin story. So, under Putin, Russia tried to create a different historical legacy by intensifying archaeological explorations in the Russian north, so within Russia itself. For example, around Novgorod. So a different origin story from the 1990s onward, with Putin personally involved in the 2000s. I don't mean he was actually out there digging at the site, but he strongly supported it. I should mention that there were archaeological digs in Novgorod before the 1990s, but the emphasis on the place in Russian history has strengthened. So if I was better organized, I would have another slide here showing where Novgorod is. It's up in the north near St. Petersburg. Okay, it's inside present-day Russia. Kiev has not been forgotten, though, in this project. I'm just checking the time. I threatened Catherine Reeder with a Brezhnev-length speech, so I just have to be careful about my time here. Back to medieval history. Kiev Rus was conquered by the Mongols in 1240, leading to the dispersion of the East Slavs and separation of the ancestors of Ukrainians and Russians from each other for several hundred years. During this period, their languages and cultures diverged somewhat. These East Slavs were finally brought together again by the Treaty of Pereyaslav of 1654, the result of the pragmatic politics of Cossack chieftains who decided that a relationship with Russia was preferable to one with Poland or Turkey. This treaty, though, was presented by Russian rulers and intellectuals as the restoration of ancient historical ties. Any later attempt by Ukrainians to break away was understood as an attack on the Russian identity itself. Even more, Ukrainians, to these Russian rulers and intellectuals, lacked a distinct national identity of their own. This Russian hypersensitivity to Ukrainian self-expression, as Ukrainian is with us today, it goes all the way back to 1654. It's been around a long time. That territory of the Cossacks was annexed outright by Catherine II in 1784. We all know of Catherine, I think. She was one of the leading enlightened absolutists in Europe, famous for her reforms of education and government along rationalist lines. She was given the title Catherine the Great not because of her enlightened rule, but because she conquered a lot of land, right? In Russian history, rulers are given the title the Great, not for anything else they do, but because they conquer a lot of land. Most of that land is in what is now Ukraine. Her strongest imperial enabler was Grigory Potyomkin, a Russian nobleman and favorite of the Tsarina. And here is where, here we go. I thought I'd mix up the slides. They're actually in the right order. Here he is, Potyomkin. Specifically, Potyomkin enabled the Russian Empire, or expanded the Russian Empire into southern Ukraine. an area given the colonialist name of New Russia at the time. So here is, I did mix up the slides. Here it is. So this is the area of Ukraine that was added under Catherine the Great, and it was named New Russia. Potyomkin founded the cities of Odessa and Kherson. Kherson very much in the news recently. And, whoops, wrong way. Now you can see what's coming up. Soviet, surprise, surprise. Right? Famously, the Potyomkin village is named after him, meaning a facade meant to hide a lack of action. Wonderful. Potyomkin allegedly put up these false villages as Catherine was touring southern Ukraine, and he did this to fool her into thinking that her development of the territory was further along than it actually was. There's some debate as to whether this actually happened, but that doesn't matter, right? So we have this concept of the Potyomkin village. Putin, interestingly, invokes both Potyomkin and the concept of New Russia to justify his own actions. So, there we go. I'll figure out this clicker by the end of the lecture. Along with furiously digging up Novgorod, another sign of how insecure Russian national identity has become is the looting of historical artifacts from Ukrainian territory occupied since last year. UNESCO has documented hundreds of cases of this. Most of it is to reinforce a Russocentric historical narrative. One of the strangest examples concerns the remains of Potyomkin. They were buried in Kherson, in the crypt of St. Catherine's Church. As Ukrainian forces closed in to retake Kherson in the fall of 2022, we all heard about that, the Russians removed Potyomkin's skull and bones from the crypt and took them further into Russian-occupied territory. No attempt was made to hide this theft. Quite the opposite. It was actually broadcast on Russian television. You can imagine that. One must say that the remains of Potyomkin have a colorful history. He died in 1791, and the grief-stricken Catherine ordered the public display of his remains in a specially constructed tomb. So his skull and bones are no stranger to being shown publicly. When Catherine died several years later, her son Paul, enraged at the popularity of the deceased Potyomkin, ordered that the remains be reburied in an unmarked grave. Like many of Paul's decrees, however, this was ignored because he was mad. During the early Soviet period, St. Catherine's Cathedral was renamed the Anti-Religion Museum of Kherson, and Potyomkin's remains were once again put on public display, and sometimes photographed with communist activists holding them. One wishes they could just leave the poor man alone. But his remains have now been made public again and put to new political purpose, this time of the current Russian nationalist project. As I said, Putin is a big fan of Potyomkin. The territory annexed from the Cossacks corresponds to the territory of modern Ukraine, but was referred to from that point as Little Russia. And you can see it here on the map. It's above New Russia. What was also common amongst Russians was the use of the term Little Russians to put down Ukrainians. I think most people know about this. The term Little Russians was used pejoratively because it indicated people that were mainly peasants and who spoke a dialect of Russian rather than a distinct language. The Russian Empire did not recognize Ukrainians as a distinct people. The discrimination continued right through the Tsarist period, all the way up to the top. Tsar Nicholas II, the last ruler of the Romanovs, apparently said, quote, "There is no Ukrainian language, just illiterate, peasant-speaking Little Russians," unquote. So that came from the Tsar himself. Now we move on into my period. So surprise, surprise, this is going to get a lot more detailed. The situation in the years just after the Bolshevik Revolution was extremely unusual. Lenin and the other Bolshevik leaders thought of modern nationalism as essentially middle class, bourgeois, reactionary, but they also recognized it as very powerful. They saw this power close up from 1917 onward. Lenin was especially worried by Russian nationalism as opposed to Ukrainian or any other nationalism, given what he had seen in World War I and the Civil War that followed. This led to the Bolshevik principle of the greater danger, that Russian nationalism, seen as great power chauvinism, was a greater danger than local nationalism. And so the Bolsheviks decided to work with non-Russian nationalism in a narrow sense while continuing to promote international socialism. First of all, a very large number of nationalities were officially recognized and supported by the Soviet state. Secondly, depending on the size of that nationality, they were given national territories of various statuses. Thirdly, Lenin and the Bolsheviks also recognized distinct national cultures and supported their development. Fourthly, they supported national languages and declared official languages in each national territory. And this reached the point where they even created alphabets for languages that had not been written down before. This was in the 1920s. Finally, the Bolsheviks supported the creation of national elites. So, for example, in the Tatar Autonomous Republic, someone who identified as an ethnic Tatar would become party secretary and so on. So, the Soviet Union was the very first country in the world to adopt affirmative action for national minorities, and it did so on a massive scale. No one since has done this to the same scale. This was in the 1920s. And even more interesting, the process that bound these various policies together was known as korenizatsiya, which translates as indigenization. Indigenization. This is indigenization, but it's in the 1920s. It's not Canada in the 2020s. So this is 100 years ago. Of course, Soviet indigenization is not the same as the way we understand indigenization, since any non-Russian nationality was affirmed. As Terry Martin also points out, this amounted to a radical strategy of imperial maintenance, since the nationalities involved were largely those of the Russian Empire. So effectively what the Soviets had done was they had held on to the Russian Empire by affirming non-Russian nationalities. So it was a radical strategy of imperial maintenance. But it was there in force 100 years ago, while we're discussing indigenization in Canada today. Over 100 nationalities were officially recognized in the Soviet Union, everyone from Russians to Uzbeks to Bashkirs. Soviet Jews were recognized as an official nationality rather than just a religion. As another effect of this, nationality became separated from citizenship. Your nationality was given on your passport. Your passport was also a high-profile document, not something that you trotted out every few years when you were traveling out of the country. Well, partially because almost nobody traveled outside the Soviet Union, you weren't allowed to. But you instead needed your passport when traveling anywhere within the Soviet Union. What this does, obviously, is greatly complicate the matter of official identity. Everybody was a Soviet citizen, but there was no such thing as a Soviet nationality. Instead, there was a huge number of possible national identities, all of them officially sanctioned within the one state. There were over 100 different nationalities. Ukraine and Ukrainians, and this will sound strange given what happened in the 1930s, Ukraine and Ukrainians were a major beneficiary of affirmative action and korenizatsiya in its indigenization in Soviet form in the 1920s. One big reason was that Ukrainians were a diaspora nationality. They lived both inside the border and outside it. So they lived inside the Soviet Union. They also lived in Poland and elsewhere. One big motive for the Bolsheviks for encouraging affirmative action was to export revolution outside the Soviet Union through the cross-border nationality, through the diaspora nationality, seeing the Ukrainians as a vehicle for exporting revolution. This was showing some signs of success in the 1920s, believe it or not. To some Ukrainians living in Poland at the time, life in Soviet Ukraine looked more attractive. One of the hardest things to explain in Soviet history is the contrast between the 1920s and the 1930s, in this area specifically. There's an enormous contrast between the somewhat benign policy, and I use that word very carefully, of the 1920s and the absolute catastrophe that followed a few years later. Under Stalin, communists who showed any evidence of Ukrainian nationalism, loosely defined, were now seen as a dangerous threat. The opportunity to use affirmative action to export revolution using the cross-border nationality in the 1920s turned inside out. Stalin instead emphasized socialism in one country. We're not going to try to export revolution. feeding the fear of the same cross-border nationality importing counter-revolution instead. So Ukrainians in the Soviet Union importing reactionary politics from Poland. The ensuing campaign against national communism in Ukraine was closely linked to the greatest disaster in Ukrainian history, the Holodomor. Millions of Ukrainian farmers were denied the food to survive. And of course, we know there was a lot of dispute about how many people actually died, but it was an absolute catastrophe. We have always and rightly emphasized Putin's background in the KGB as probably the formative influence on him. This has often been expanded to the Soviet Union itself as a formative influence. This is partially true. He has reminisced fondly about the USSR as a geopolitical superpower, but he has long rejected, even before he was president, the Soviet Union as a political model to follow. So Putin is not actually trying to recreate the Soviet Union in many respects. He has given no indication of, for example, restoring communism. Instead, as we see from his speech of February 21st of 2022, 3 days before the invasion, and his justification for the invasion, he blames the Soviet Union. While Putin didn't take issue with supporting non-Russian nationalities in general, he blamed Lenin specifically for the creation of the Ukraine in the early 1920s as a false state, and Ukrainians as a false nationality. Ukrainian historians point out that Lenin didn't create Ukrainian nationalism or national consciousness. They were already there. A modern nationalist movement in Ukraine can be dated back to the 1840s. Lenin also wasn't the first to create Ukraine as a state. Although three of them existed very briefly, there were as many as 4 Ukrainian states in existence during the Russian Civil War from 1917 to 1921. Putin ignores that. He likes to think historically, but the history he looks to is pre-Soviet, actually that of late imperial Russia, and especially its policies and approaches. He rejects the Soviet policy, the Soviet approach towards Ukraine. So he looks at late imperial Russia and especially its policies and approaches. This is the Russia of Tsar Nicholas II, an odd choice to model yourself upon, but there we are. So I'm going to give you a strange example of this. So a national poll was held in 2008, well after Putin came to power, on the most important person in Russian history. The most important person in Russian history. The medieval Prince Alexander Nevsky came first, but the late Tsar's prime minister, Pyotr Stolypin, came second. I remember being surprised at this at the time. I was surprised by Russians' historical knowledge. They knew all about Stolypin. It turned out I was very naive. The Putin government had manipulated the poll for its own purposes. So they had decided that Stolypin would come in second place. We know this because independent polls were carried out at the same time, and it showed that few Russians would actually have placed Nevsky or Stolypin even in the top 25. They probably voted for Alexander Pushkin and other people as well. So we know that this was a Potemkin opinion poll, right? It was a fake poll, but it showed the orientation of the Putin government, and that has continued. So who was Pyotr Stolypin? Why is he so important to the Putin government? He was prime minister of Russia from 1906 to 1911, regarded as one of the only 2 really exceptional ministers under the late Tsar Nicholas II. He was regarded as a modernizing conservative. Stolypin could be intensely repressive. He became prime minister right after the 1905 revolution, and the phrase Stolypin neckties was coined to refer to the nooses around the hanged, of whom there were hundreds, right? He speeded up, he changed the judicial process to hang hundreds of people. Stolypin could be brutal, but he was also far-sighted. He was a social engineer. Russia was in deep crisis. Stolypin's wager on the strong and the sober encouraged peasants to take on ownership of the strips of land they farmed. The aim was to create a new class of strong, independent farmers that would support Tsarism. By 1906, when Stolypin became prime minister, there was no longer a stable social base for the Tsarist regime. Stolypin engineered Russian society to create this new class of people to support Tsarism. War came in 1914, too soon for this to work, but the early signs were that it was working, and it's generally regarded as the best chance for the survival of Tsarism if Russia had not gone to war in 1914. So Stolypin was a very clever guy. So that didn't actually save him. He was assassinated in 1911, and the circumstances are very murky. Anyway, the more general point is that it is this late Tsarism, late Imperial Russia, that Putin looks to as a precedent, not the Soviet Union. I'm looking at the time here again. I think I've gone on for half an hour now or more. I think I was given 45 minutes, so you can cut me off at any time. But anyway, I think you'll find this interesting. So moving along to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, right after this collapse, I'm looking here at the attitudes of Russians in general. The majority of Russians did not recognize Ukraine as an equal partner with Russians. Few Russians denied that Georgians were Georgia. Georgians are Georgian. Estonians are Estonian. And even Chechens are Chechen. Many Russians questioned the very existence of Ukrainians. They looked at Ukraine as something artificial that would be reunited with Russia one day. The language of Ukraine was still considered a Russian dialect. British journalist Anna Reid noted at the time that the very closeness of Ukrainian and Russian culture, the very subtlety of the differences between them, is an irritation. And this is maybe the biggest point I want to make. This is a broader characteristic of Russian history. Those who are closest to Russians in identity in some way are more likely to be repressed. For example, over most of the Tsarist period up until about 1870, the Tsars were relatively tolerant, I'm in quotation marks, of religious believers who were not Russian Orthodox. So the religious practices of Lutherans, Catholics, Muslims generally were left alone as long as these believers were loyal to the Tsar. So it didn't matter so much who you worshipped as long as you were loyal to the Tsar. All believers in Doukhobors, however, were treated much more harshly because they were breakaway sects from Russian Orthodoxy. They are much more similar to the religion of the state than the other religions. Now here I'm going to go into a strange jump. I love these wild historical jumps. You may not be so keen on them. I'm now going to move to politics under Stalin and make a similar point. So there's a similar phenomenon for the political opposition to Stalin. It was the Trotskyists who were repressed most harshly of all the political opponents of Stalinism. My apologies to any Trotskyists in the audience, but it was, and I say this partially because my postdoctoral supervisor before I came to Lethbridge was a Trotskyist, and he would not like this at all. Anyway, my apologies to any Trotskyists in the audience, but it was partially because Trotskyism was similar to Stalinism that it presented the greatest threat politically. And I would say, and I may be challenged on this, it is similar again for Ukrainians. Because Ukrainians are culturally and linguistically so similar to Russians, any success they have in building liberal democracy poses a special threat to the illiberal Putin regime. In each case, whether in religious belief, political ideology, or language and culture, it's the very similarity that provokes a sharp reaction from the Russian authorities. They are especially threatened. The denial by many Russians of Ukrainian as a national identity is linked to Putin's initial objective in the current war to dismantle Ukraine as an independent state. There was his alarming speech of February the 21st, 2022, that Ukraine does not have a history as a distinct state and by implication does not deserve to exist as such. Tied to this, the idea was to seize Kiev in the opening days of the invasion. There's no accident that Kiev was the objective. Kiev was the key to the problem of identity for Russians as much as for Ukrainians. I want to briefly discuss two other causes of the war, to one of which I give more credence than others. The first is the Russian concern over the expansion of NATO and that Ukraine may be about to join. There's actually nothing new about this. Instead, what we can note is the consistency of the Russian concern. They have genuinely been worried about this from before the breakup of the Soviet Union. From Gorbachev to Yeltsin and then to Putin. Putin has been calling for a new Yalta for years, which would establish and recognize neutral buffer states between Russia and the West. The right of Ukrainians themselves to determine their own foreign policy is simply not recognized by Putin and the security establishment in Moscow. To Putin, Patrushev, and others, the security needs of Russia absolutely override this. Whatever else you can say about the Russians, they have been entirely consistent on this for decades, since the late 1980s. Or have they? Or have they? While they speak against NATO enlargement, bear in mind that the trigger for the invasion of 2014, so the previous war in Ukraine, was potential Ukrainian membership in the European Union, not NATO enlargement, right? So it was a different issue that was the trigger there. I will also speak briefly about Russian claims to have launched the war to fight fascism. It is true that 20th century Ukraine had the ultra-right-wing nationalist movement led by Stefan Bandera. More broadly, Ukrainians in very large numbers did collaborate with the Nazis. There were many, for example, fighting alongside the Germans in Stalingrad, although Italians, Hungarians, and Romanians were also there in very large numbers. An even bigger point, though, and this was made through a slide presentation by Stéphane Gouvernement in one of his lectures at the GALT last year, is that many, many more Ukrainians fought with the Red Army than with the Wehrmacht. I do not have the numbers today, Stéphane has them, but from memory, Ukrainians in the Red Army outnumbered Ukrainians fighting alongside the Germans by at least 10 to 1. We can safely assume that not all Ukrainians fighting in the Soviet Army did so as enthusiastic volunteers, but still, right, many, many, many more Ukrainians fought with the Soviet Army than with the Nazis. I had intended to show you tables plotting the presence of ultra-right-wing groups in post-1991 Ukraine and Ukrainian politics, but there have been so many parties of all political orientations contesting elections that it would be difficult to understand on the slides. If I put this on the slides, you would sort of need a microscope or a telescope to figure out what the information was. I will say that support for the right-wing Svoboda party has slipped from about 10% in the 2012 parliamentary elections, the first election that it contested, to under 5% in 2017, then 2% in 2019. This doesn't address the presence of hard nationalist positions in more mainstream parties, but Russian propaganda about fighting fascism should be understood as largely that. Okay. Jumping over to something else. So the retreat from the attempt to take Kiev at the beginning of the invasion last year was a major defeat for Russia. Given the political and cultural importance of Kiev, it was the military expression, the attack on Kiev was a military expression of the denial of Ukraine as an independent state, and it failed. So the Russians fell back after this initial failure on another war objective, one from 2014. So they returned to an objective from the war in 2014. A major element in Russian denial of Ukrainian separate identity has been the existence of large Russian populations across the border in Ukraine. Here we go again with the cross-border populations. Russian cross-border populations played a crucial role in 2014, both in justifying Russian intervention and in supporting it. Crimea was the only region in Ukraine with a majority Russian population, while the Donbass had a very large Russian minority. Already in 1994, long before he became president, Putin was speaking in public about the need to protect the 25 million Russians who lived outside the borders of the Russian Federation. An increasingly important component in the ideology of the Putin regime after he came to power became its alleged right to protect ethnic Russians abroad, the Russian diaspora. In 2007, an organization called Russian World was created in Moscow by the government and private sponsors. It is headed by Vyacheslav Nikonov, grandson of Vyacheslav Molotov, Molotov's grandson. I wish I had included a slide of him. You can see the family resemblance very clearly. It's quite alarming. So we have Molotov's grandson heading this organization called Russian World. Russian World promotes the Russian language and culture abroad, promotes a positive image of Russia, and also supports the Russian diaspora, so Russians living abroad. So far, this sounds really benign, right? What could possibly go wrong? It supports the Russian diaspora. What is interesting is how it defines that diaspora. The diaspora, Russians living abroad, includes those countries with large numbers of expatriate Russians. The United States, Germany, Israel, Britain. Toronto is probably in there too, right? When I lived in Toronto, it seemed I heard Russian on the streets every third time I went on the streets. Toronto as a country. The Russian diaspora, the Russians living abroad, according to Russian World, does not include Belarus or Ukraine. They are redefined as the inner core of Russian World from 2007 onward. Nikhanov's organization implies that Russians living in Ukraine are not living abroad. They're not living outside the country. And this has been going on since 2007. It is important to note that Russian World was founded in 2007 in response to the Orange Revolution of 2004 in Ukraine, not to NATO enlargement. Okay? So, a large part of the rationale of the Russian government in prosecuting the war in Ukraine is on behalf of ethnic Russians living there. Ethnic identity anywhere is a complicated matter, and in this part of the world with its Imperial Russian and Soviet legacies, it is especially complicated. It's far more complicated than what Putin and Russian World are projecting. So, I think I have about 10 more minutes. Is that all right, or that's okay? All right. You can start throwing things at me, right? If I'm going on too long. So, Paul Magashji of the University of Toronto has attempted a basic typology in Ukraine today that captures some of this complexity. So here we go. First of all, he finds there is the ethnic Ukrainian identity determined by the belief that a person is Ukrainian if she or he speaks the Ukrainian language, identifies as a Ukrainian, and believes in the idea of Ukraine as a viable nation state. Magashji says that increasing numbers of young people throughout all parts of Ukraine have embraced this approach to their identity. Secondly, there is the ethnic Russian identity. For those where Russian is the primary identity, often the exclusive language of communication, but the cultural affinity is to Russia. The third identity that Magashji finds is particularly interesting. This is the Soviet civic identity, which refers to people in Ukraine, often called Savoki, who were born, raised, and educated anywhere in the Soviet Union. Association with the Soviet state and its cultural and political values became the main characteristic of the Soviet civic identity. In the absence of the Soviet Union, Ukraine's Savoki have looked to its successor, the Russian Federation, as their ancestral homeland, to which they might again one day belong politically. Unsurprisingly, Savoki are mostly of the older generation, today 50 years or older. The final identity that Magashji finds is the Ukrainian civic identity. This views the state as defined by a set of shared values to which people of all ethnicities may subscribe. Citizens who espouse a Ukrainian civic identity expect their state to abide by democratic principles, including the rule of law and the protection of human rights. Their model is clearly the European Union, to which they aspire to belong. As you might imagine, Magashji favors the fourth identity and argues that Ukrainians have been moving in this direction since independence, so the Ukrainian civic identity. This does downplay the identities of those who are neither Ukrainian nor Russian, nor does it address the language law of April 2019, where the government made Ukrainian the compulsory language in public life. Apart from Russia, that law has been criticized by Hungary and Human Rights Watch for not safeguarding the rights of minorities. So Magashji's ideal of civic identity does not necessarily capture the recent direction of government policy, but it does capture some of the complexity of identity in Ukraine currently. He does add that each identity can also combine with others to form the self-identity of any Ukrainian. You can be two or more of these identities, so some of them obviously are antithetical, so that seems unlikely that you could combine all four, for example. But the combination of at least two is in fact what has happened. Since Tsarist times, a share of ethnic Ukrainians have identified themselves as native speakers of the Russian language. By the time of the 2001 census, 14.8% of self-identified ethnic Ukrainians in Ukraine claimed Russian as their native language. Some 27% of respondents in a 1997 poll selected the answer both Ukrainian and Russian, when asked to identify their ethnicity. This complexity could work for Russian ambitions, but it could also work against them. From 2014, the strategy of Russia fighting to protect ethnic Russians has not worked. Whereas the population of Ukraine was deeply divided in its loyalties in 2014, Ukrainians now are much more united against Russia. Fluid identities have helped to loosen loyalties. We can see this change in Ukrainian voting patterns. I had planned tables of the parliament to show you tables of the parliamentary elections, but again, there are so many parties that they would have been unreadable. So I've just simplified this to look just at Ukrainian presidential elections. There is a bit of a problem with the slide. So for the last election in 2019, Zelensky was not the only candidate. There is Poroshenko, but he's fallen off the bottom of this slide, okay? So I don't wish to argue that Zelensky took over as an autocrat, certainly not. It's just there's a, Poroshenko has fallen off the bottom, anyway. Otherwise, this slide is clear. So I show the top two candidates in each presidential election. Russian-leaning candidates are indicated in red. In the 1991 referendum on independence from the Soviet Union, this was approved by 92.3% of voters. Even in Russian-speaking regions of eastern Ukraine, large majorities supported independence from the Soviet Union. And this is reflected in the presidential candidates of the time. So as you can see, in 1991, neither candidate was really Russian-leaning. By 1994, the Russian-oriented population within Ukraine was reasserting itself politically. We see the emergence of a candidate, Kuchma, who favored a balanced relationship between the West and Russia, meaning a considerably more pro-Russian position than his predecessors. And this pattern continued. The two top contenders of the next few elections split between Russian-leaning and Europe-leaning candidates until, unsurprisingly, this stopped with the Russian invasion of 2014. The top two candidates ever since have both been Europe-leaning. And then I go into a lot of statistics about the regions, which I think I will skip. There are similar but subtler changes in both language and religion. As of 2022, more than 2/3 of Ukrainians overall claim Ukrainian as their native language. Russian language speaking is in decline, or at least the identification with it. Religious affiliation also shows a strengthening Ukrainian identity. I don't think I want to get into the complexities of the various Orthodox churches in Ukraine, but there is a Moscow-backed Orthodox church, and the number of believers has plunged from 23.6% in 2010 to about 12% in 2021. So the support for the Russian-based Orthodox Church is fading away. The Russian government is aware of the decline of Russians, the Russian identity, and has worked since the invasion to boost Russian identity amongst Ukrainians. So, for example, it announced in the summer of 2022 the fast tracking of Russian passports for Ukrainians and that all Ukrainians are Russian citizens. And not surprisingly, this doesn't seem to have had much effect. So summing up, I have presented here on the role of identity, both Ukrainian and Russian, in relation to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm better qualified to talk about Russian identity and have said more about it, but I've spoken on Ukraine too. A consciously Ukrainian national identity has existed since the early 19th century, but its expression has been sporadic and uncertain. There is a real sense that Ukraine is a nation that has found itself and is finding itself as we watch. Certainly, the continuous existence of an independent Ukrainian state since 1991 has played a big role, remembering that there were previous Ukrainian states, but they existed only for a very short time. The fact that an independent Ukrainian state has existed for over 30 years now has really helped to boost Ukrainian national identity. Looming over everything, of course, is the mobilizing effect of the war itself. Nobody likes to be invaded. As a former American president once said, I never thought I'd be quoting George W. Bush when I speak, but that's what he said. Nobody likes to be invaded. He was speaking of somewhere else. The post-imperial overreach of Russia has had precisely the opposite effect of what was intended. Here, though, I have highlighted the fluidity of national identity in Ukraine. It could go in both directions. For example, strengthening Russification, but as it worked more to strengthen the Ukrainian identity, or the Ukrainian state. While the Ukrainian state has achieved broadly increasing legitimacy and prestige, both amongst its own population and internationally, Russia continues to search for political legitimacy. The country was severed from its past in 1917 and again in 1991. The 1990s gave no respite. They were known as dikhi capitalism, or wild capitalism by Russians at the time. The Russian flirtation with liberalism was not a success, to put it mildly. The accession of Putin to the presidency was a reaction to that deep instability. At the same time, Russians owned the past in a way that Ukrainians did not, in the sense that they had been the dominant nationality historically. Russia under Putin has become increasingly illiberal. This is largely a reaction to the failure of liberalism in the 1990s, and I can say a lot more about that. But the Putin regime needs more than anti-liberalism, needs more than just anti-liberalism to stabilize it. The Putin government looks to the pre-revolutionary past, specifically late Imperial Russia, a past that it does not include an independent Ukraine or Ukrainian identity as a solution to its deep problem of political legitimacy. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. Here I was asked to provide a bibliography, so here are some of the sources I've looked at. I have to mention here Anastasia Sereda. I don't know if she's here this evening. She wrote a wonderful MA thesis at the University of Lethbridge a few years ago on Ukrainian politics, which I learned a great deal from. So thank you very much for listening to me.